Hi, everybody. I'm Vivian Schiller. I'm the Executive Director of Aspen Digital. We are a program of the Aspen Institute that looks at all things across media technology and innovation. So thank you for joining us for this latest episode of Disinfo Discussions, again, hosted by the Aspen Institute in tandem with our Commission on Information Disorder. We're talking to top experts in the field who can help us make sense of the information crisis. These are designed as a resource for our commissioners, but also for you, the broader public. Today, we are focused on kids, and I am so fortunate to be able to speak with Jim Steyer. He is the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media. They are the nation's leading nonpartisan organization dedicated to improving the lives of kids and families by providing the trustworthy information, education, and impactful voice they need to thrive in the 21st century. Jim is also a nationally known author. His books include Talking Back to Facebook and The Other Parent, the inside story of the media's effect on our children, a topic that we're talking about today. So Jim, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here, Vivian. Thank you for having me.
Yes, great. So the information landscape has obviously changed quite drastically since you and I were very young, or I'll speak for myself anyway. Kids, yeah, kids really have to navigate a very complicated network of communication, both socially and academically. So can you help us sort of unpack the role of the internet and to a greater extent, social media, the role that it has played in shaping the worldview of young people?
Well, first of all, Vivian, I think that as a parent of four myself, and having watched them all grow up with a relationship with social media, it's incredible how much young people's self-image, their view of the world, their relationships with peers and adults and educators, all are now framed in a digital context. So I think the commission that you've put together is a terrific idea. And from young people's standpoint, I think that social media can be a great connecting tool, but it also can have major downsides, particularly in the area of misinformation and disinformation, because I think while all of us have seen the challenges of misinformation and disinformation over the past few years, young people probably have the least amount of experience in determining facts and if you will, being literate about news and information on the internet. So clearly, young people are incredibly impacted by the internet and by social media, and they live a 24/7 digital life these days, but they need help in basically decoding a lot of the information that's sent at them and navigating some of the treacherous waters of the internet.
Yeah, I think some would argue maybe that younger people are not necessarily far less literate than other parts of the population. We see this as a problem across all ages. On the other hand, we're talking about sort of the next generation, the people who will be the future leaders of, of government, of business, of society. So what do we need to do to help kids become more literate so that they know how to approach information that is being shared with them in a way where they do not fall susceptible to mis and disinformation?
So I think there are several things that we should do. First of all, as a parent, and I'd say this to every parent out there, I think given the way that the internet and social media are shaping our kids' lives, we have to have an ongoing discussion with them as parents about the impact of technology and social media on their lives. And I think that has to start as young as preschool years, certainly during their K through 12 years. You have to have an ongoing conversation with your kids about what they're exposed to on screens and on the internet and on digital platforms. And that can range not just from misinformation and disinformation, but to bullying and the comparison culture where kids are constantly photoshopping their images on Instagram or YouTube or Snapchat or wherever they're posting information. So I think parents have a big role, but fundamentally, we as a society have to completely embrace the concept of digital literacy and citizenship. And that's a big part of the work that we do at Common Sense Media. In fact, we created in many ways, the field of digital citizenship at the Aspen Institute about a decade ago with our colleague Howard Gardner, the famous Harvard Education School professor, who was doing pioneering research at the time about the ethical implications of young people living in a digital media world. And Common Sense Media and Professor Gardner and his colleagues at Harvard Ed School came together to create what was at the time the first curriculum ever about digital citizenship and digital literacy. And now that curriculum is in over 110,000 schools around the world, about 85,000 in the United States. So well over half of the schools in the United States have that curriculum. But the essence of it is a recognition that kids live in a 24/7 digital world and that they need to be digitally literate. And also they need to understand citizenship and civic skills so that they are ethical, responsible, intelligent consumers of, but also users of the internet and social media. And so I'd say that we as a society have to make a fundamental commitment to digital literacy and digital citizenship for every child in this country, and also for adults as well.
How do you do that in a country where, first of all, the education system is, like, unlike in most other countries, there's not like a national curriculum. It's
Right.
Sometimes comes down to a local area, and also in a world that is more and more polarized, where any kind of conversation around what is an appropriate source of information, what do we mean when we say civics, what do we mean when we talk about democracy and liberty, what do we do about that, Jim? What's the solution?
So I think you're asking, there are two different questions there, Vivian.
Yeah, there are.
They're both really important. So I'll answer the second one first. One of the things that we've realized at Common Sense Media from the outset, we now have close to 150 million unique users, right, in a year. And they range in all different political and ideological perspectives. So one thing I think you have to do is be completely nonpartisan about it. You just cannot let politics enter into the mix. And I think that's critical.
Is that possible?
It is, actually, because I think that most of the issues about digital literacy and citizenship are just what I would say human and common sense issues. And you can actually help people decode inaccurate disinformation and misleading stuff without taking a political perspective on it. And we've been very successful at that. And so that's number one. And then I'll answer your first question now. You're absolutely right. The United States has about 130,000 schools. And I think there are 13,000 total school districts in the United States, and there's no national curriculum. There's no national distribution system. So in countries around the world, for example, in Australia and in the UK, the government adopted our digital citizenship curriculum and therefore sent it to all the schools. That does not happen in the US. So the way that we were able to distribute our curriculum to the great majority of schools in the United States was to go district by district and to actually build a distribution system for the curriculum that took us probably 6 or 7 years to implement. And what we did was meet with the key leaders at school districts around the country, with leading education groups, with leading educators. And then it became almost a word of mouth thing, because we had this great curriculum that we put together with Howard Gardner and the Harvard Ed School. And we basically built our own distribution channel into the schools. So now we reach the great majority of American schools with a curriculum. But to your point, a school in Minnesota let's take a middle school in Minnesota teaching 6th or 8th graders digital citizenship, might use it very differently than a school in Virginia or Florida. And what we do, so we have to have, therefore, at Common Sense Media, we actually have people on the ground who work with the individual districts and sometimes the individual principals, so that they can take our curriculum, which is a state-of-the-art curriculum. We just revised it a couple of years ago with Howard Gardner and his Harvard colleagues, and tailor it for the individual school district or school. So there's a lot of work involved in the United States because we have such a decentralized education system, but it's doable. And in the case of Common Sense Media and digital literacy, we've been able to have basically a mass and very successful curriculum by building our own distribution channel into K through 12 schools in the country.
I want to drill down for a little bit more into the politicization issue.
Sure.
I mean, we know that there are certain districts, certain states who have approached curriculum around, particularly around science-based teaching around things like the causes of climate change,
Correct.
around issues, frankly, of evolution even.
Correct.
How do we deal with, if we have a school district or curriculum that is not emphasizing scientific evidence-based information, how does that comport with teaching sort of news and digital literacy?
Great question. And I'll tell you, we do have the experience with it, which is quite interesting, which is why I actually mentioned, say, Florida, Texas, California, Minnesota, all different. And by the way, there are districts within those 4 states alone
Right.
that have rejected certain scientific teachings and some of the evolution stuff, et cetera. The truth is we have not run into those issues, though, in digital citizenship and news literacy because of the nature of the curriculum we've created. And so we're as popular or more popular in conservative red areas of the country and very conservative school districts as we are in, say, a big city urban district like New York or San Francisco, where you'd expect a more liberal district. And the truth is that you do it by focusing on the facts and sort of the basic techniques of digital literacy and news literacy, and not going down the rabbit hole of politics and partisanship. And it, by the way, that requires experience, because you're correct. If we were gonna, I'll give you an example. Obviously, there's been a tremendous amount of misinformation, disinformation in the context of our elections. Incredible. And by the way, on the advocacy portion of Common Sense Media, we have been probably the leading organization in the United States, probably along with the ADL, in going after misinformation, disinformation around elections that really undermines our democratic norms and institutions. But we've also done that very carefully and tried not to make it a Republican or Democratic issue or a liberal or conservative issue. We've actually gone after the platforms that have amplified the misinformation and the disinformation. And we've tried to do it in a very even-handed way. So for example, we created a movement, if you will, but a coalition effort with the Anti-Defamation League, the NAACP, the Color of Change. Rashad is your co-chair of this commission, and Free Press, and then a dozen other civil rights and children's groups around the country to create a campaign aimed at the platforms, as opposed to going out, and that basically we really focused on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And what we said to them was, you have fact checkers. You are capable of interpreting misinformation and disinformation on your platforms. It is your responsibility to stop amplifying both misinformation and disinformation, and also hate and racist speech. That's what brought some of the civil rights groups into it. So but we did it we did it in a very nonpartisan way. So we didn't make it about Joe Biden or Donald Trump or this particular politician or that. We talked about the importance of the platforms themselves investing deeply in both removing misinformation and disinformation from their platforms, but also being fair judges of that. And I think in a digital citizenship class or K through 12, we're able to do that, I think, with great confidence in a nonpartisan way.
I want to come back to that in a minute, sort of the role of the platforms, the role of government and others. But before I do, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about how what you know, and I know that there's been a lot of, you personally and your organization have focused a lot on, the developing brain of a young person, and how information is perhaps received differently, processed differently, and of course, intermingled with issues that affect sort of self-esteem, mental health. So what do we need to know about the developing brain of a young person, and what that says to us about how we go about trying to solve for the information crisis to help them be good consumers and sharers of legitimate information?
It's a great question. And I'll tell you, the way we built the curriculum is in modular. So when you talk about the developing brain, you have to think about it literally in the lifetime of a child. So, and as a parent of four, I've seen it all. So that in the early years, 0 to 5, basically, kids basically are exposed to all sorts of images on a screen. And some kids today, obviously millions of kids are exposed to social media, by the way, and all sorts of inappropriate content, just because they're sometimes plunked in front of a screen where there's inappropriate content. In the early years, in the preschool years, the kids really can't even distinguish between fact and fiction. They cannot distinguish between ads and real content. That goes up until probably second or third grade. So, and we at Common Sense spend several $1 million a year on research on the impact of technology on children and their brains. And there are some people at the University of Washington and a couple of other major research institutions around the country who've also looked at the developing brain. But your general point is absolutely correct, Vivian. So young people do not have the ability, particularly even in their teen years, to always distinguish between fact and fiction. Their brains are developing. They're also much more susceptible to certain kinds of emotional swings and mental health issues that are just the normal parts of childhood and adolescence. And those also impact the ability of a child, depending on their age, to filter the information that's coming to them over social media platforms, over the internet, and all forms of sort of media and technology. What we know is that that's why it's so important to think about the context of misinformation, disinformation in the context of young people, because their brains are less developed. Their faculties and their ability to determine the difference between something that's true and false and something that's complete misinformation is limited because of their age. And some of that has to do with will have to do with their educational levels and how much they've been taught digital literacy and citizenship at home and in school. But that's why this is such an important issue for young people, because their brains are developing and their cognitive skills and social emotional skills are also developing. So in the past few years, you've started to see, and we've been a big part of this, school districts and educators around the United States and globally looking at social emotional learning issues that are relevant to this, that actually allow young people to be better decoders of information, if you will. Now, sometimes that's about politics and misinformation, but sometimes that is just about, as you mentioned, self-image, self-esteem, their own sense of identity. So kids are at this critical formative stage of their development, and they're just being bombarded today on 24/7 on digital platforms in a way that when we were growing up, Vivian, we had TV sets that our parents could control, and maybe there were 4 or 5 major channels in those days. And so it's a completely different reality. And that's why, by the way, we think parents have such an important role in at least having an ongoing dialogue with their children about the messages and information they're receiving. But it's why we think that every school in the United States should be teaching digital literacy and citizenship from kindergarten on. It's the reason we built our curriculum that way. And so we break it down almost into 2-year cycles. So if you look at how we've built the digital citizenship and news and media literacy curriculum, it's very different for first graders than it is for fourth graders, than it is for sixth graders, than it is for eighth graders. And they're 2 different levels of high school curriculum. So in creating a nonpartisan curriculum around that, you have to basically take into consideration the age of the child and therefore their brain and social emotional development issues. And we have done that. And I think so far so good, but we need to just continue to improve the curriculum and the products.
And that social emotional development aspect of it, aside from just sort of the cognitive ability to tell, fact from fiction, means that certain kinds of misinformation is going to hit certain communities harder, particularly communities of color who
That's right.
are in particular targets of mis and disinformation campaign in a significant way.
And actually, Vivian, that's such an important point, because if you really look at how algorithms work. So one of the problems that we have in this area is the fact that the large platforms, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, some of the biggest platforms that young people and adults are on, are driven by algorithmic models where there is not a human intervention. And they tend to go to the lowest form of the brainstem, if you will. So fear, anger, hatred, stuff that evokes really strong emotional reactions in people is what gets over the algorithms. The algorithm's goal is to keep you there, the audience there, for as long as possible. So the more outrageous the content, the more that people tend to focus on it and pay attention to it. So the more extreme, the more violent, the more angry, the more fear-oriented, the weirder, stranger that it is, that actually triggers the algorithms in many cases to keep you there. That is a very big issue in general for young people, but particularly for communities of color, because there's a tremendous amount of racism and hate speech and very emotionally laden content, direct targeted because of the specific algorithmic capabilities of targeting different audiences, that generates emotional responses, but also keep you glued to the screen. So this is one of the big things that we have to address in the broader issue of misinformation, is that we have allowed young people, but also all of us, to essentially be at the mercy of an algorithmic model that is not based on what's good for society or good for young people, but what's on the profit maximization in an attention-driven economy. I mean, we are basically the big platforms over the past decade have been in an arms race for our attention. And that's true in terms of kids, but it's also true for adults. And in an arms race where attention is the value that you're trying to maximize because it becomes a profit, because that's how profit is made, it's a very dangerous world, because they play to the worst of emotions, and algorithms, unfortunately, unless they're well crafted and constantly recrafted, appeal to almost the lowest common denominator and the lowest level of the brainstem. That is a very big issue for us to address as a society.
All right, so we've talked about various vectors of solutions. You talked about the kind of curriculum, yours and others, that school systems can adopt. You've talked about the platforms and how they can, downrank harmful content, not amplify it or target it algorithmically. We've talked a little bit about the role, of course, of the family and the parents in educating children or helping them be discerning consumers, so to speak, from a very young age. What is there a role for the federal government here?
I think so, definitely. But let's talk about that, because first of all, in the macro level sense, I'd say, having been the head of, we've been certainly among the leading, if not the leading, advocacy organization focused on tech issues over the past decade. So we've covered issues like privacy. We've covered issues like misinformation, disinformation. We call this platform accountability. That's the term that we tend to use. And I'll get into a second the role of the federal government in this. But there there are other very important issues of inequality, digital equity, the digital divide, that have federal government solutions. In the misinformation, disinformation, the central issue has been the fact that the 1996 Communications Decency Act contained a provision, I'm sure you'll interview other people for the commission about this.
We have.
Called Section 230. It's called Section 230, which basically was a get out of jail free card for the social media platforms and the big internet companies like Google, Facebook, et cetera. And what it basically said is they're not liable for the user-generated content on their platform. They cannot be held liable for that content. And so as long as they can, as the big platforms, algorithmically driven, I might add, live in a get out of jail free world where there's no liability for them, they basically go for profit maximization in an advertising-based model. And so there's no question that we as a society, and given your background as a journalist and in public broadcasting, I'll give you the example. We have successfully dealt with the issues overall of misinformation and disinformation in broadcast and cable television, in newspapers, in radio, et cetera. And our point of view is that the biggest platforms like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, et cetera, are essentially the biggest publishers in the world. And therefore, they should be treated in the same way that PBS is treated, or ABC is treated, or Comcast is, or the Washington Post. And therefore, there are ways to, and I am a professor at Stanford. I've taught civil rights and civil liberties as a professor there for over 30 years, now making myself really look old. But I will tell you that there are ways to balance our commitment as a society to the First Amendment and freedom of speech and expression, but also moderating content. And so I think that it is high time that we developed a federal government strategy and legislation that deals with both the both creating misinformation and disinformation and amplifying it. And in the case of the platforms, it's largely the amplification function that's so critical. So we at Common Sense believe that there are legislative solutions at the federal level and at the state level, because we run a lot of legislation in the state of California, where our headquarters are, that can basically punish and regulate companies that continue to amplify misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, et cetera, that are consistent with a First Amendment regime. But I'm not suggesting this is as simple, as you know well from the work of this commission. This is not simple, but it's doable. This is an absolutely doable issue. But the other thing I'd mention is, in addition to the role of the federal government, and that means Congress getting its act together to regulate this and to overhaul Section 230 and related legislation, there's a huge burden and should be on the industry to clean up their act, period, full stop. Because the industry has the wherewithal. These are literally trillion-dollar companies, and they have the wherewithal to moderate and remove content from their platforms that is harming our society. And so I think over the next couple of years, that's why I think this commission is so well-timed and so important, is we have to have both a federal legislative and regulatory structure set up. I think that will include the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission, in addition to Congress and the White House. But I also think we have to have much greater pressure on the major companies and even smaller companies themselves to be held responsible for the content on their platforms.
For anybody watching this, we have, as part of the series, I did an interview with Jeff Kossoff and Marianne Franks, and the entire conversation was about Section 230, what it is, what it isn't, all of the various forms, that the various suggestions of legislation and regulation around it, and the various outcomes. So I'd encourage anybody that wants to learn more about Section 230 to listen to that episode.
You know, Vivi, can I add one thing to that?
Of course.
I think it's really important that we acknowledge that the U.S. government overall, and this is not a partisan statement, because I think it reflects both White House administrations and congressional folks on both sides of the political aisle, have done a pretty pathetic job of regulating media and technology over the last 20 years. If you look at the last 20 to 25 years of American history, during which time our lives have been, all of our lives, including our children's lives, most of all, have been transformed by media and technology, but particularly these extraordinary new technology platforms. And now they are the largest, most powerful companies in the history of the United States, and the largest and most powerful companies in the world. The fact that there has been virtually no federal regulation and legislation of these companies is a national tragedy and a national disgrace. And I'm very comfortable saying that. And I say that to my friends and colleagues on both sides of the political aisle. None of the previous administrations took this seriously. They were way too friendly with some of the large technology platforms. They let them get away with a tremendous amount of stuff that other companies over time were not allowed to get away with. And that's why I drew the comparison to broadcast and cable television or the newspaper industry, et cetera. And so the US government has got to change its tune now. And I am hopeful that Congress on both sides of the aisle, plus the Biden administration, will for the first time really step forward and deal with this. And that is a nonpartisan critique, but it is something that we have to come to terms with as a society. And I would argue it is one of the great failures, if you will, of the past 20 to 25 years of American government policy, certainly at the federal level, is that our government simply failed to deal with the regulatory and legislative issues that were their responsibility. And I think the public should hold them responsible for that.
Well, the momentum certainly seems to be now.
I agree that the momentum's changed dramatically, Vivian. Yeah. And that's why I said, that's why I think this commission is so well timed. Yeah. But these guys should have been dealing with this a decade ago or 15 years ago.
Well, what's the expression? The best time to have dealt with it is when the problem happened, and the second best time is today.
It's
So I think
today. We're here.
I've mangled that, but you know what I mean.
It was a guy, but I agree. We're here, and it's time
Here
to
we
get.
are.
But it's time to get serious about this, and to not make it partisan, because this is really a fundamental issue about our society and our democracy and our children. It's not a partisan issue if you think about it.
I'm less optimistic than you are about the ability for it to stay nonpartisan, but let's.
That's because you live in Washington and I live in California.
That's true. So, so let me just ask you one last question, and then I will give you back all, the generous time you've allotted to us here. So these discussions, these conversations that we're having are intended to inform the members of the Commission on Information Disorder as well as the general public. Is there anything at the intersection of young people, mis and disinformation, media literacy, and even the issues of mental health that we've touched on, that you think the commissioners should know as they prioritize issues and solutions, again, across government, the private sector, and civil society?
Sure, I'd give you three things. Great question. Number one, I would urge the commission to come out and say that digital literacy and digital citizenship should be a required part of the educational curriculum in every K through 12 school in the United States. Now, as we know, most of the education decisions are made at the state and local level, but I think the commission saying that digital literacy and citizenship is an incredibly important part of every school's curriculum going forward would be a very important statement. Look, I call the work that we've done with Howard and our colleagues at Harvard, and that, as I said, is in 110,000 member schools today, reaching 25 million students a year in the United States alone. I think that should reach every single student in the United States, and it should be a required part of the curriculum in a nonpartisan way. And I'm very confident that we can do that. So number one is, I would urge the commission to come out in a very forceful way towards requiring that be taught in schools. Again, complicated education system, as we discussed earlier, but I think that's number one. I think second, I believe that the major platforms and also some of the smaller companies should be held to account for the impact of misinformation and disinformation on young people, both, and therefore should pay for the expenses involved with educating people around the United States, and B, be held liable for more extreme cases where they're amplifying false and misinformation, disinformation, overt hate speech, etc. And I think that the commission should be very strong in the way that it holds the tech and social media companies accountable for that responsibility, because they are literally coining money and at the expense of the public, or using us, our information, our data as the product. So they should be held strictly to account when they are not following practices that benefit society, particularly young people. And then I think the third thing would be to strongly recommend that these regulatory solutions be viewed in a bipartisan or nonpartisan context. If they are broken down around political lines, we're not going to get anywhere, or we'll never get as far. And I think that the great majority of Americans, no matter what, not all, but the great majority of Americans can agree on the importance of democratic norms and institutions. This is a very difficult time in our society for sure. But I think that the commission really coming out strongly about the importance of a nonpartisan, bipartisan approach, if you will, excuse the pun, a common sense approach to these issues, I think is the right way to go. So those are my three, and keeping kids front and center in this, and the importance of educating young people about this, I think will go a long way to the bipartisanship that I'm referring to.
Jim, thank you so much for bringing your experience and your expertise. This is a really great, useful conversation. Jim Steyer, Common Sense Media, thank you so much. Really appreciate you spending time with us.
And Vivian, thank you so much for your leadership on this and for this great idea of putting this commission. And the more we can cooperate with you and collaborate with you on this, the better. You and the Aspen Institute and Aspen Digital deserve great credit for having the foresight to do this. And we really appreciate it and totally psyched to work with you on it.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim.
Great to see you.
Bye-bye.